I put these placeholder frames in my vertical stack here, but I really want these to be the lines of text that describe the album. So I can actually add text to a frame just by putting it inside the frame element. I don't usually do that because the frame is applying some strange defaults to the text, like having it centered like this. I could override those defaults, but a frame element also brings in a lot of capabilities like animation and interaction that I don't usually need if I just want to display some text. So in this case, I don't need to interact with this text. I don't need it to do anything when I tap it or click it, and I'm not going to animate it or anything like that. So having each one of these lines of text be inside its own frame is sort of overkill, especially since there are plenty of HTML tags that I could use that are specifically meant for displaying text. So instead of using a frame here, I'm going to use an h1 tag. If you remember all the way back to, I think, the very first video, we talked about h1. h1 stands for a level 1 heading. So the h1 gets some default styling applied to it, but I can easily customize how it looks by using the style property on the h1 tag. Style is one of these properties that gets the weird double braces when I define the value. So it gets one set of braces, just like all React properties use braces around any non-string value, like these. And then the value that we'll send to the style property is an object. So the second set of braces is defining that object. And inside this object, we can specify CSS-like properties to style this text. So we can set things like font size, font weight, and color to make this look how we want. Now I say that these are CSS-like properties because the names here are slightly different from what you'd use in CSS. In CSS, these would be font-size and font-weight. But in React, we remove the dashes and use camel case for the names instead. But as long as you remember to make that change, most CSS properties will work just fine in the style object. So now I'll add an h2 tag for the artist's name and an h3 for the year. And I'll set the style property for each of those to get the text to appear how I want. Since I'm setting a custom style for each of these, the specific tag that I'm using doesn't really matter. I could use an h1 or a p tag for all of these and just give them each a custom style. But by using different tags for the different heading levels, I'm sort of indicating some semantic hierarchy in my code, which I like. And I'm going to leave this frame here for now as a placeholder for the star ratings that we'll add later. So now this looks pretty good. If I were prototyping this, I'd probably just leave this as is and move on. But depending on how big this style object is, you might find that it feels cluttered to be defining the style for each piece of text in line like this. So there are a lot of different ways that you could try to clean this up. You could pull this style object out into a variable or a constant that you define elsewhere and then just send that variable or constant to the style property. You could, instead of including the style inline, add class names to the tag and then add a real CSS file to your project that refers to those class names for styling. Or you could use something called styled components. So I see a lot of tutorials recommending styled components. I'm not going to use it here because I think it's overkill for what we're doing. And it requires a lot of setup and going into the terminal to install things, and we don't really want to get into all that just for 3 lines of text. You should by all means go check it out if you're interested, particularly if you find yourself doing more complex stuff with CSS in your projects, but we're just going to stick with what we have here. Now, of course, I don't want my text in my component to say album name and artist name and year. I want it to display the custom values for each album. And those values will be passed into my component through the props object. So inside my h1 tag, I'll want to display the value from props.title. But doing this will literally display the text props.title, which is not what I want either. I want this to display the value that's stored in the variable props.title. So to get the text to display the value of this variable instead of the literal text, I just need to wrap it in curly braces. So this tells React to evaluate this as a variable instead of just displaying it as text. So I can put props.title and props.artist and props.year as the values to display in each of these. So all that text just went away because I'm not actually sending any of those values through props yet. If I want to check to make sure that things are working right, I can set some default props for this component. So if you remember in our switch, we set the default width and height for how the component should appear on the canvas. Well, you can use the same trick to send default values to your component for any prop, not just width and height. So I can send values for my title, artist, and year props, and we'll see those show up in my component if no other values are sent. And then when I do send actual values for these props, those values will overwrite the defaults, so I won't see these placeholder values. And notice for the artist name, I added this text that says by before the artist name. I did that by just adding it as literal text before the value coming in from props. So I can combine literal text and text coming from variables just by putting the variable inside curly braces and leaving the literal text outside of the curly braces. So that was pretty easy. What did we end up with? We added some HTML tags to our JSX to display the text info for our album. And for each of those tags, we set a style property to define how we want the text to display in our component.